So this next recording is going to be about classic or golden age of Pericles sculpture. And we're going to start with Plato because his ideas kind of influence a lot of what happened in ancient Greece. But I'm going to sort of take it backwards. If you look at Plato's dates, he lived from about 428 to 348. Which means that he comes after the Golden Age or the classical period. He's actually living in the late classic period. And so in some ways, his ideas about art and his ideas about literature and philosophy in general are actually kind of they're a culmination or summary of a lot of the ideas, and he sort of wrote things down. Remember, he was kind of a student of Socrates, although there's no evidence that he actually hung out with him directly as far as I understand. So Plato is this guy who is important because he records a lot of important ideas from that time period, but he's also kind of a whacked out character. So first of all, his ideas on art. He didn't like artists. Artists were basically charlatans for him, and he believed that they were sort of making a copy of a shadow or of an illusion of things. So he has this treatise on the ideal society that's called the Republic, and if you actually read the Republic, it's full of like really kind of crazy ideas. For instance, how people should live. For instance, in the early ages of development, he believes people should live in these sort of communal barracks and colonies, that they should be run by philosopher kings. Now, that doesn't sound too crazy, but what he believes is up until you're probably about a teenager, your training shouldn't be necessarily intellectual, but should be consisting of a lot of physical activities and a lot of marching and singing. He also didn't believe that artists should be in his ideal society. He also, just read it, it's a little crazy, but his ideas really influenced how we think. And the most important one is the allegory of the cave. And in the allegory of the cave, Plato outlines an idea in which you have these sort of prisoners who are locked in a cave, and they have their heads constrained and their arms constrained, and they can't really move. And all they can see are shadows, which are basically silhouettes, so shadow puppets that are being cast on a wall. So imagine kind of being locked up in a TV room, and you can't move your head, and the TV screen is completely filling your vision, but it's only silhouettes of things. It's not real. Also think of the movie The Matrix. That would probably is really, The Matrix is based on Plato's allegory of the cave. So the people who live in this cave can't really see reality. They only see the illusion of reality. And so he describes in this allegory of the cave that they escape. Maybe one character gets out of this cave, and as they go into the light is too bright. It hurts their eyes. They can't deal with it. And when you leave the cave, you go into the world of full vision. You can see all the colors. You can see all the shapes, all of the forms, and you are actually sort of shocked by everything you see. Well, that person has gone to the light, is now enlightened. Well, the next thing is they go back into the cave. And if they go back into the cave, they have a responsibility to rescue the people who are in there, sort of like in the movie The Matrix. But there's a problem. If you go into the cave, people are going to think you're crazy. And they're going to think that you don't know what you're talking about because you see things in a different way. Well, this is kind of an allegory for education, but I think it's also an allegory for how he felt about art. He felt that art was basically a bunch of constructions or illusions that were not really based on reality. And they're a copy of a copy, because for Plato, reality is a copy of the ideal world. So it's kind of like if you can dream a better world, you might bring it out into being. And so he believed that artists were copying the world itself, and the world is just a shadow or reflection of universal truths. And so they shouldn't be allowed in his ideal society. Now remember, this comes after the so-called Golden Age, in which the Athenian culture rebuilds the Acropolis, and where we have probably about 50 to 70 years of art that's being made. So let's start by looking at two sculptures that represent the changes that Plato records in his Republic. And if you look at the date of the one on the right-hand side by Polykleitos, it's called the Deriferous, and it dates from about 450, which is contemporaneous, right around the same time as the rebuilding of the Acropolis. We're going to look at it in terms of a sort of theory of evolution, kind of like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, in which survival of the thing that's best fitted for the environment, it's not survival of the best, it's survival of the thing that is best suited to the times that and environment that it's in. And there's an art historian named Ernst Gombrich who actually talks about the same thing. And what he says, he calls this schema and correction. Sometimes he refers to it as schema and mimesis. And what he basically suggests is that the form of sculpture in art, especially in ancient Greek art, gets more and more realistic and more naturalistic over time as it evolves. And for him, that literally was getting better. And in some ways, this represents the symbolism or iconography of the art. For instance, if you look at the Deriferous here, it symbolizes a more realistic, naturalistic person. And this fits better in with the context of the times, because what they wanted in their art was to represent ideal citizens and the ideal person. And they were striving for almost a Renaissance-like ideal that we use today, even for the basis of our education. So how does the form reflect this? Well, the first thing is, if you look at this archaic kouros, and kouros, remember, just means boy, it represents a young athletic male. I think that this was actually probably used as a grave marker and also stands for an ideal citizen who might have even fallen in battle. And he has a sort of V-shaped torso with a thin waist. He's stepping forward. He is very muscular. And it's not naturalistic musculature. It actually is sort of stylized, right, in a geometric way. Well, if you look at Polykleidos's version, you can see that there's a little bit of a sway to the hips, that his weight is mainly resting on one leg. He's got a little bend to his leg. And you can see that he would have been carrying a spear. And that's why he's called the Deriferous, because in terms of him being the Deriferous, Dori means spear, phoros means to carry, and all of his weight is shifted through his body. His torso is turned one direction, his head is turned another direction. Now, what this is called, in a way, is called a counter posture, and we'll address that, and it's a much more lifelike posture. You can see how first the archaic kouros takes something from Egypt with the foot stepping forward, a slight sense of movement. Now we have in Polykleidos's Deriferous some real movement forward. And that represents kind of a naturalism that's important, that relying on nature for realism, and also depicts a more naturalistic person. Now, these depictions of people by Polykleidos, this sort of ideal person, in terms of its symbolism, it's almost more important than what it actually looks like. So what I'm talking about is, this is an extremely handsome and muscular young man, and he possesses what's called Kalos. And Kalos literally means the good and the beautiful. For the ancient Greeks, they believed that the package represented what was inside. The cover represents what's inside the book. So Kalos is a Greek word which means both good and beautiful. And we can see that in this instance, he is young and beautiful and powerful and muscular in that way. He's standing in a pose that makes him look more natural, more naturalistic. And that pose is called contrapposto. Contrapposto is literally a counterpoise or a counter posture. Some historians actually describe it as an S-curve running through the body. And I kind of want to clarify that you can see that he has his back heel is slightly lifted. The other foot is slightly in front of it. In some historians' point of view, that means he's actually taking a step forward. I actually think that it's more like he's paused and he's about to move, and that there's a sort of counterbalancing curve and a shift of weight through the hips and the shoulders in this body. And then, of course, that turning of the head one direction, and then his torso or chest is pointed another one. So why are we looking at this? And it says in the caption, Museo Archeologico Nazionale in Naples, Italy. Well, and then it says Classic Greek. Well, the reason why is almost all of the sculpture we're going to look at from here on out are Roman copies of Greek originals. So on an exam, you're going to have to write in your exam that this is a Greek classic sculpture, but this is a Roman copy. So what you would just do is you would say Polykleidos is Greek high classic, and this is a Roman copy of Polyclitus's sculpture. Now, the reason for this is most of the bronze sculptures, and originally most of Polyclitus's sculptures, would have been made out of bronze and cast in what's called the lost wax process, and we'll look at that in a minute. And those were melted down for weapons. And when the Romans came to power around 190 BCE, one of the things that they did was they went to Greek classic sites because they really admired Greek culture, and they actually took a lot of Greek artifacts back with them to Rome, and then artists copied these artifacts. And sometimes really inferior artists copied a lot of these Greek artifacts. And so we have sort of cheesy copies of classical Greek sculpture. Now, there's another term that comes up, and that's canon. The canon of human proportions. One of the things that Polyclitus is known for is he wrote a treatise, which is a comprehensive book that contains everything that you need to know about sculpture. Unfortunately, we've lost the book. We don't have a copy of it. But in it, he outlined what's called a canon of proportions, or a canon system. A canon is basically a standard, and you can see from this definition I have that a canon as the standard for proportion system is one of the things that we have in canons in law, canons in religion. It's just basically a body of principles or rules. And so sometimes you'll see this sculpture is also called the Deriferous, sometimes it's called the canon, and sometimes it's called the spear bearer. And that's kind of an important idea, because in his canon of human proportions, Polyclitus decided he was going to outline what was the ideal form for the human form. It's not the most realistic, it's actually the most ideal. Now think about Plato, who comes about 30 years after or 20 years after this sculpture is made. Plato believes in relating things to the ideal world as well. So there are distortions in the human figure here that Polyclitus is depicting. So for instance, if you look at that sort of weird pouch above his genitals, that's not a normal kind of construction. And even the stylization of the muscles, even though this is a Roman copy, we get a little sense of some of the distortions and stylizations that Polyclitus included in his work. The process that was used to make sculptures like this is called the cire perdue, or lost wax process, and we've looked at this before. And I think that in this instance, the diagram that you see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen is actually a very realistic way of looking at how Greek sculptures were made in particular. Usually when we talk about the lost wax process, especially in, for instance, in the Manticlos Apollo, when we looked at that, the sculpture was made entirely out of wax, and then it was encased in clay, and then that sculpture that was made out of wax and encased in clay was then heated up, and the wax in the center in the cavity melted out, and then they could fill that cavity with actually molten metal or bronze. In the instance of sculptures like the Deriferous by Polyclitus, what they actually did was they would make the sculpture out of clay first, then make a sort of skin of wax around that, put in some metal pins that would hold everything in place, and then actually put another clay sort of mold around it, and then the space that's between the two would be heated up. The whole mold would be heated up, the wax would run out, and then you can pour the molten bronze in the center of that, and it yields a sculpture that looks something like these. These young warriors we're looking at, it's also called, they're called the Ryachi Bronzes, and the two that are in the middle, or the two on the left that are made out of bronze, are actually a front and back view of the same figure, and the one on the far right is actually another figure. And they kind of have an interesting story, because these sculptures were found off the coast of Italy in a town called Ryachi, and these scuba divers were diving underneath the sea and saw these hands sticking out of the bottom. Imagine how scary or creepy that would be. And then they went back after, I guess, they recovered from their shock, and they pulled them out of the water. And so the Ryachi Bronzes are good examples of classical Greek sculpture from the high classic period that were meant for export. And so they were probably on their way to Italy, or they were being brought back from Italy after the classical period, but we're pretty sure that they are classic. And they're good examples of how Polyclitus's Deriferous probably would have looked. Now, these had a clay center, so they actually had to use some kind of ultrasound and break up the clay and then clean off the salts on the outside. And so now these sculptures are actually hollow. And an interesting component to them is that they're standing in contrapposto, but both the sculptures, actually their heels on both feet are down, are stable, and that would have made them more stable to stand, and they originally would have been carrying spears. They are also what's called polychromed. Poly means many, chroma means color, and means that they used a lot of different materials to kind of give it color. So there's bronze with bone, and for the eyes, they are glass eyes. They have silver teeth and copper lips and nipples, and it was just meant to make it more colorful. A little shift if you compare the Deriferous to the warriors that we see, these Ryachi Bronzes. These Ryachi Bronzes have beards. And so, there's been some talk about this with my students. Why do they have beards? Let's take a look a little closer at the face. It probably represents either wisdom, that these are older warriors who are a little bit more experienced, or they actually could be foreigners, because I don't think that all the Greeks wore beards. But we'll see a sculpture of Pericles in which he actually does have a beard. So probably these represent ideal older warriors, and it's the idea of Kalos. They're beautiful, they have athletic bodies, but they're also very strong and powerful. Now, looking at the face, you can also see that there are elements in it that are kind of idealized and stylized in a very strong way. For instance, the hair is hanging in these sort of geometric ringlets. You can see that the eyebrows sort of run directly into the eyes. He has also extraordinarily large eyes as well. So these are distortions that are based on an ideal and also are based somewhat on earlier forms of sculpture and probably relate back to the ancient Egyptian sculpture. In the same way that the Kuroses, or Kure, or Kurai, I guess is how it's pronounced, related to ancient Egyptian sculpture with that sort of wig-like hair and this stance, I think that these are Orientalized as well. And what I'm talking about is the term Orientalized that we've used before, just literally in the 19th century meant anything that was from Mesopotamia or Egypt, sort of anything that was considered kind of East. And it's an archaic or outdated phrase, but that's what we're going to use because that's a standard in art history. So the way that his face is stylized is probably based somewhat on Egyptian sculpture and Mesopotamian sculpture. Now, there are also distortions or stylizations in the face of any kind of sculpture from the classic period in ancient Greece. And so we're going to take a closer look at some of these distortions or stylizations. The distortions and stylizations that we see in this sculpture, this is called the Kyrian Boy because it was made by a sculptor we're pretty sure named Critios. Sometimes you'll see it called the Ephebi of Critios because Ephebi means athlete, and it dates from about 480, which is also the High Classic period, and Critios was an important Greek sculptor. If you look at the way he's standing, first of all, you'll see it's in a sort of contrapposto pose where there's a counterbalancing curve running through the body. And so all the weight would have been on one leg. There's a slight turn to the head in one direction. The torso turns the other. But if you look closely at his face, you can see actually the eyes are overly large. And he also kind of has a little smile or a grin on. And remember, we call that the archaic smile. The bridge of his nose sort of terminates into his forehead, and we call that a Greek nose as well, and you can see that the eyebrows flow directly into that. There's no little bump in where you would, for instance, rest your eyeglasses, and the hair is stylized in a geometric fashion. The ears are also kind of in a slightly too high up and too far back place. Now, all of these distortions we're looking at in terms of the anatomy and the anatomy of the face are pretty much intentional distortions. They were not trying to be realistic. They were trying to create an ideal that was closer to what we refer to as the Platonic ideal. And remember that this is far in advance, far before Plato comes up with his idea of the Platonic ideal. So what I'm suggesting is that Plato, even though he codified or wrote all these things down, he's not the originator of these ideas. He just sort of wrote them down for a lot of other people. What I want to do is kind of discuss the distortions in classical or high classic Greek sculpture and how to get ahead. And so remember I was talking about Ernst Gombrich just before, and he is this art historian who has the idea of schema and mimesis. The schema would be the original sculpture, and then the correction would be the updated version, or mimesis is mimicking nature. Both of these sculptures you look at who are dated from around the same time, from about 480 BCE, have the same kinds of idealized distortions or stylizations in them. The eyebrows that run into the nose, the overly large eyes, the slightly distorted hair that's stylized in a geometric way. So we're going to see that this is a standard kind of stylization that we see. And I want to trace the evolution of this stylization from the earlier periods, for instance, from Mesopotamia. So if we start with this sculpture of Sargon of Akkad from Mesopotamia, circa probably around 2700 BCE, you can find some other dates that might even date it as far as 2500 BCE. And this sculpture of the Kouros, the archaic Kouros from about 600 BCE, you can see they share similar kinds of qualities. The hair is stylized in a geometric way. The eyes are overly large, the eyebrows flow into the nose, but in the case of the Mesopotamian figure, it's a little bit different, and we have these sort of thick eyes and almost an archaic smile. That could be argued that that's not really there. Now, if you look at the archaic sculpture, you can also see he has ears, whereas Sargon, remember, those were lopped off and chopped off to sort of hurt the sculpture out as a form of disrespect to Sargon by the people who stole the sculpture. But we can see that they are very stylized in the archaic Greek piece on the right-hand side. So if we compare the Kouros from 600 BCE to the blonde boy from 480 BCE, we can see that they do share in some of the distortions. However, the later sculpture from 480 BCE is decidedly more naturalistic. It looks a lot more real. However, we still have overly large eyes. We've got the ears slightly in a kind of weird place, and the nose that runs directly into the forehead. And those are standard distortions that were or stylizations that had happened over time and remain consistent, including the geometric qualities of the hair. Of course, the hairstyle is different, but we can see that they strive to make the hair look almost machine-made or geometrically stylized. If you were to do what I've done here with these lines, if you stick your fingers in the corners of your eyes, not too hard, and run them back, you can actually feel that the tops of your ears are actually level with the corners of your eyes. And if you do the same thing with the corners of your mouth and pull your fingers back, you can probably notice that your earlobes are right at the same level as the corners of your mouth. So that isn't the case here with this sculpture. We can actually see that the eye line and the mouth line are in the wrong places. In fact, the standard proportions of the face are pretty accurate in this, except for those two deviations where we have the eyes really run through the center of the head. If you were to go from the chin to the top of the head, you can actually see the eye line is around the center, and the nose is about halfway between the eye line and the chin, and the mouth is halfway between the bottom of the nose and the chin. Those are standard drawing proportions. I'm actually an artist as well, and I teach these proportions to my students, and they're not doing that. They're making the nose a little overly long, and they're repositioning the ears, and the nose is kind of distorted. So I used Photoshop to fix some of these things up. And so as sort of a before and after plastic surgery picture, we see here on the left-hand side the original sculpture. And of course, I didn't fix his alien eyes, those overly large eyes that we saw before. But I think that you can actually see that by moving these things around and actually providing a little dent where the nose is, that this thing looks a lot more realistic than the other sculptures that we looked at before. So my thesis or main idea for this is to actually say to you, these are ideas or distortions that were meant to be there, that they actually meant to do these things, because for them it would make the sculpture more beautiful and possess that quality of Kalos, which is an idealized beauty that we've been talking about. We'll be talking about later Greek sculpture in the next lesson.